Welcome, guys. Welcome. Hi. Hi. Take your seats. Very nice. Getting a good attendance. Okay. So, hi, I'm Vasilis. I'm really happy to be hosting this session for WeTest. I've been a part of the community for a few years, and it's wonderful to see it grow and see you all here. Up next, we have Wim Sellis, Director at Tech Champs. He'll be presenting the Stability Playbook for Hybrid App Automation, where he will show us hand-on techniques for the very popular framework Appium, how to enhance stability and decrease flakiness by working with the limitations of Appium's default context switching methods. Let's give a warm welcome to Wim Sellis.
Thanks for the introduction. Today, we're not going to talk about hybrid applications. We're going to talk about your assumptions. First of all, thanks also for joining. There are a lot of good tracks that you can select from, and I'm also honored that you're all here. You're not listening to all the other good tracks. So there must be something attractive in the title that you're wondering if you're doing something right, yes or no. But when I was making this presentation, I was thinking about kind of like also my journey and then also my journey here in Athens. Like it started in 2020, first ever Ministry of Testing on the 14th of February. It was kind of like, it was a dream for me, also for my wife. I took my wife on Valentine's Day, and I was also a little bit surprised that everybody was in the room. It was around 100 people or something, not spending the evening with their partner, but spending it with me. That was kind of strange. It felt strange, but it also made me think about it when I was creating the slides. And I was thinking also about a theme, and I had a theme at the beginning, and I was like, okay, no, you are, and I hope I pronounce it correctly, you are kind of like my philarakia. And when I was thinking about that, I was like, okay, let's do a friend theme. So hopefully also a lot of people have seen this series. Please raise your hand if you've seen. Okay, so there will be a lot of gifs and memes also from the series here in this presentation. So yeah, let's start. And let's start first of all with a promise, because I'm going to promise you one thing, that after this presentation, something will click. Pun intended. But basically after this presentation, hopefully you will have the right user mindset. That you're not going to be that person that only is going to script. But when you're going to script, hopefully at the end of this presentation, you'll also know a little bit more about how everything is working. And last but not least, that you will also think about a real person, because we're all doing it. Hello? Yeah. We're all doing that for the end user who is using the application. He or she is paying our salary. Well, basically your employer, but the employer gets money from your customer. So try to keep that in the back of your mind every time that you're busy with mobile. And to kind of like get back to the subject about your assumptions, I've seen a lot of stuff happening in the community, in the industry, in testing, about people that know a lot about web, and they try to use that knowledge and move that over to mobile. And let's use that. Let's use that story. Kind of like it started so well. You are basically an expert in web. You've been automating web applications for years. This is basically you 6 months ago. You have your knowledge of the web. You know your selectors. You know basically all the backdoors. You know how to clean states. You know how to mock APIs from the browser. You basically know everything. You even know every Stack Overflow answer which you can trust. And yes, we're basically the old school craftsmen, not asking everything to AI. We're basically 6 months ago where Stack Overflow was still being used a little bit. And then your client comes to you and tells you, Wim, we're going to release a native application. You've been automating the web for years. You know how it is. It's pretty easy for you. It's basically the same as web. Well, trust me, it isn't. Spoiler alert. So, what I would then normally do is I would just do my homework and do my investigation. So you do your investigation, you watch YouTube, you go to conferences like this, you also read documentation, you also play with it, and then you figure out, okay, I need to have cross-platform support. I also need to have it in one code base because I'm lazy, I don't want to have to maintain two code bases. And I want to support emulators, real devices. I want to run everything in the cloud. So in the end, when you've done your research, when you tools, then you figure out Appium is the right tool to use. And based on your research, you've chosen it for all the right reasons. So, what could possibly go wrong? Well, the first thing that you do is you try DOM. Like, how can I select elements? And this is already the first point where you're like, okay, this looks different. And to be honest, you're going to look at this like, shit, my eyes. What can I do with this? Proceed. And you know XPath because you've used it also on the web. XPath knows you. You're going to use selectors like this. But then, yeah, you've got two platforms, you've got two trees, two separate selectors. This will be a little bit harder also to maintain. And in the end, if you run this and you compare this to what you've done on the web, yeah, this is fairly slow. But then it gets personal. You've got stable scripts, at least what you think. A model appears out of nowhere. You're like, WTF, what's happening here? Then a permission model is there, and your script is stuck. It looks at it as if it owns money, and you cannot do anything. And then you need to reset your app state, because every time you cannot find it. There's no way to do that. You cannot remove cookies or whatsoever. And then you search for backdoors. And again, we're searching on Stack Overflow. We find an answer of 2000, at least a question from 2019 with no answer. And you're like, okay, I need to lay down. And when you're on your couch, you're like, okay, it's not me, it's Appium. Appium is the problem here. Well, not really. Let's dive a little bit deeper into that. Because I believe that we're trying to drive a car here, but we don't have the right understanding. That we don't have the right understanding of the tool, but maybe also not the right understanding of what our end user wants. So basically, you brought the right skills, you've done your research, you already have your automation skills, but you brought it to the wrong territory. And let's also go back to what we already know. What did the web tell us all those years? Basically, that we have standards. There are standards for the web. The W3 specification for every element, every interaction, every JavaScript call, everything is there. We also have a live tree. Everything that happens on HTML, if you just open DevTools, you would see basically everything changing all the time. You also have selectors that travel. And what I mean with that are you select it once and for every browser. Doesn't matter if it's Safari, Edge, Brave, Chrome, whatever. Select it once, use it everywhere. And we have the DevTools on demand. So if we're stuck, debug the DevTools and we can see basically everything. We can manipulate everything. And when we're talking about that manipulation, you also have those backdoors with those JavaScript injections, clearing your store. And then last but not least, this is something a lot of people realize. The platform itself basically has no... Microphone is constantly falling. Hear that? Or it's not? Check, check, double check. Well, we'll see. Test, test. Um, the difference there for web is that sometimes if you have pure native HTML components or elements, like for example a drop-down, select box, or a checkbox, they will appear different on Linux, Windows, and a Mac. But if you just look at how we now handle those, especially the developers, then you will see that the developers are styling those, so there's hardly any influence of the OS itself. If you then look at native, you can just say this. It's not in native. It's not there in native. So that's the first challenge already that we have. And maybe already the first assumption that if you're moving from the web to native mobile, from a technology perspective, that you will have challenges there. So if we just compare those two, and just say, okay, we have those standards on the web, we've got HTML, we've got some kind of UI hierarchy, and sometimes, or basically if you use a tool called Appium Inspector, we will look into that later on, you have something which is called XML. It's a snapshot. It is platform specific. We will look into also snapshots later on. We have that DOM live tree. Everything that's happening can be seen there, can be retrieved from there. It is a snapshot for Appium, basically just taking a picture, literally, in a moment in time. Then the selectors, yeah, we can just use the selectors from the web on every browser. Well, we need to think about a locator strategy. Which selectors we're going to use, yes or no. Like I mentioned, the DevTools, live inspection, Appium Inspector is basically just a snapshot tool. And then the backdoors, basically no backdoors, unless on native that your developer is adding some extra backdoors for you to make life a little bit easier. And then last but not least, the platform-specific stuff, yeah. Like we've got iOS and we've got Android. They're totally different OS versions. There are all kinds of things that are different. And now think about kind of like traveling. And this is something that happened to me in the past. Kind of like you think that you know something. You just put it in your navigation system. And for example, I want to go to Athens. And to be honest, I had this when I was working at a test consultancy company. We had a weekend away with the partners. I need to be somewhere in Belgium. It was somewhere in Rode something. I just put in the address. I was just driving. And in the end, I didn't end in the place I need to be. I was in Brussels. It's kind of like the same what we also have here. If you're using the wrong data, if you're not knowing what you're doing, you might end up in Canada. It would be nice. Kind of like it's a long flight, and hopefully you will figure out that something is wrong, but that could happen. And if we then think about what we know from the web, which assumptions will follow, are basically like XPath works everywhere. Well, that's basically true. On the other hand, you will regret it when you're going to rely fully all on XPath. And the element tree is always up to date. No, it is a snapshot. And snapshots lie. Pictures also lie. They're from the past. They do not represent what you see now, what your customer is seeing now. Those are things that we need to be aware of, especially also for the automation part, and we will look into that later on. A lot of people think that Android and iOS should behave the same or are the same. Well, they're not even close. They just do what they want to do. We all know Apple, we all know Google. They will make our life really miserable when we talk about automation. To be honest, I love Apple stuff. Having said that, also this part about the assumption is basically the web. Well, to be honest, we know how that story ends. And if we use all those assumptions, in the end, your test script will take longer. And you could ask yourself, do I really add value for my end user? But let's also now dive a little bit deeper, because we also want to know what's inside. So let's take a look a little bit more into the web versus native part. Where are the differences? What are the things that we need to be aware of? Well, first of all, when we all use the web, we know these elements. like the div, a button, HTML, the div, the button input, basically all those elements. This is what you get for Android and for iOS, 2 different trees. And this is not something that we came up with. This is basically something that you get back. You need to work with this every day if we're talking about native automation. And if we dive a little bit deeper, then we can look into the attributes and the properties we have there on the elements. Basically, we have the opportunity on the web, or when you have a good relationship with the developer, we can define them ourselves. We have control on what we see and what we don't see. This is what you get back just as an example from Android or from iOS. This is determined by the OS, and this is determined also by Appium. There's no way to influence this. Maybe with a specific accessibility ID, something that you should definitely add to your apps, because your apps should also be accessible. But that's it. This is what you get back. This is what you need to work with. So you had control on the web. You basically do not have control on native applications. You just need to read what you have, use what you have. So when we dive a little bit more also into kind of like the snapshots, then, and we look into what we get, for example, for Android, then we can compare Android and the web as following. You write your test, and if we dive a little bit deeper, we for example, have this selector. Let's just say we use XPath. And XPath and that selector will dive a little bit deeper into Appium, and, well, you will have the DOM, which is basically always accurate. But for Android, we have something which is called the accessibility node information tree. And this is not XML, this is basically just a text blob also. It needs to be translated by Appium into XML, and there you will always already lose some time. And that means that normally you would get back an element ID immediately from the web. The chance that you will get that from native applications is also there. But if you want to use it, which might be a few hundred milliseconds later, it might be that that element is not there. Maybe the element is there, but the reference is not there. We could also have still elements on the web. We've seen it in the past also with Selenium, but 9 of 10 times it has to do with the fact that your element is still moving. So we didn't wait for animations, and now we have proper tools that also wait for the animations, but that's not possible with native. And you already heard me say there's no XML. Well, for iOS, there's basically no XML. Android already is built based on XML, because if you build an Android application, you will have XML somewhere, but for iOS, there is no XML. It has a huge text blob, way bigger than on Android. Because on Android, you will only get back what you see in your screen, but for iOS, you will basically get every screen, every menu item, even if you're not seeing it in your screen. And then imagine that that translation needs to be done every time. Every time you use an XPath, we ask Appium to translate that complete text blob into XML. That's already taking a lot of time. So if we then also look into what will happen with iOS, it's basically the same steps. But the chance that you will find your element is there, but the chance it will be there when you want to interact with it might not be. It might fail also with a still element. So you also need to think about that. And then last but not least, how can we also look into the tree? We'll use Appium Inspector for it. But again, this is not based on live streaming. This is based on a snapshot. Just a moment in time. And now imagine that you're creating your script, you just open your Appium desktop, and you're trying to find your element, but there's something happening in the app itself. It will not find it anymore. Because this was a snapshot from, let's say, 10 minutes ago. You also got some coffee from your colleagues, because you want to make friends. So, this is also what I saw a lot with people. They have some expectations, and there is reality. If you just look at Appium Inspector, a lot of people expect that it's just streaming. No, it's not. It is that snapshot. It's a frozen snapshot. You also have 2 trees. And last but not least, you also need to think about how am I going to select that element. So when you ask Appium for an element, then the following will happen. Unagi. Who has seen this scene? I know that a lot of people. This is basically the scene where Ross tells, I think it's at least Monica, and it might be Phoebe or Rachel. Like, it's about total awareness. Well, he's basically just ordering sushi here. And that's basically also what a lot of people think when an element, or when they are going to click on an element. You think you know what happens, but I think not everybody knows what happens. So let's dive a little bit deeper into that part. Let's take a look also how Appium really works under the hood. So if you write this specific nice XPath, which I would not advise, but if you would write something like this, then there is a complete tree that will be walked through, or a step tree that will be walked through. You would first have your test. Then, for example, I'm a huge fan of WebDriver.io. WebDriver.io would send an HTTP call to the Appium server. And then the Appium server is like, okay, this is nice. Do I need to automate Android, iOS? Oh, based on the capabilities, I know that I, for example, need to do Android or iOS. So it's basically just routing to which driver it should use. The driver is being called, and then there is an HTTP call going to the device, which has a specific app installed, and that app will retrieve all the information. And it will then translate basically the data it gets back. It serializes that to XML, and that XPath will then try to find the node it needs to interact with. And then we have a deserialization. It will go back to the app, and from the app it will go back to the driver, and from the driver it will go back to our script. And then we can interact with it. So there are already a lot of hubs here. And based on your action, we are going to repeat every step here. Or based on finding elements, we are going to repeat every step here. What we need to be aware of is that if we have one select, or if we have one button that we use a lot, this is going to happen every time. And especially with XPath, if you're going to use that, we're going to do the translation over and over and over again. And this can become very, very slow. So let's dive a little bit more also into the drivers, because we now know at least what Appium is doing under the hood. Let's also take a look at the drivers. And there are two drivers that 9 out of 10 people, or maybe 100% of the people are using here, which are the UI Automator 2 driver and also the WeTest driver. They're both basically the officially supported drivers from the vendors. And kind of like the most important part in here, as you can see also for Android, like I already mentioned, if you look at your screen, that's basically the same that Appium will see. So for example, if you would have text on your screen based on 3 paragraphs, the first paragraph is shown. The other 2 are, for example, below, at the bottom of your screen. You're not seeing them. If you would then ask Appium, okay, what's the full text? It will only give you back the first paragraph. If you would then compare that with iOS, it will basically return everything that is given back by the accessibility tree, the UI hierarchy from iOS. Then last but not least, we also need to be aware of the fact that we cannot reuse what we already translated. We cannot cache that. And the reason for that, it might speed stuff up, but we also know that all our apps are constantly animating. Everything is changing all the time. So we need to build up that tree every time. So why does it matter that we understand what we're doing here and which locator we're using? Basically, the bigger the hierarchy, the bigger the snapshot, also the slower also finding of elements will be. If you have 200 views, well, it pays out in very slow responses. It's not something that specifically Appium is, how do you say it, is at fault. It already starts with how the internal systems, the internal automation systems from Google and Android are looking at the source. So what makes it faster? Yeah, have smaller trees. But is that something that you can influence? No. But the thing that you can influence is basically your selector. So let's also take a look at those selectors. So if you're now thinking about the web, we already had, for example, CSS that we're using, or maybe if it's if you've got those low-code platforms that your developers are using with dynamic IDs, it's pretty hard to kind of like automate them. So you will use XPath. The things that I would advise is, for example, Accessibility ID. This is the one for Android that looks immediately into the source. It's not looking into a translated table. No, it's looking immediately into the source of Android. And if you're using WebDriver.io, you can use a tilde, for example, like this. And this could be the label that your end user is hearing when he's using text-to-voice, their screen reader. So you would already help yourself and also your end user. That's the end user who's paying our salary. So if you want to, there's a win-win. Or sometimes I would say there's a win-win with an M. But having said that, next one. We also have the XPath. Like I already mentioned, Android is already faster than iOS, but so you could use XPath. Or there's a UI selector that you can also use. It's basically a Java string. Downside is that it's pretty verbose to write. So there's a lot of code you need to inject. And also there's no syntax highlighting in there. So you could easily make mistakes also here. I will share the slides. So you can, oh sorry, my t-shirt is too small. You saw my belly. No, just kidding. All right, now let's take a look also at iOS. The things that I would advise, at least for iOS, also do the accessibility ID, and also the advantage. If you would have that on Android and your app is basically the same, you could use the same selector. And again, you would have that win-win situation also for your end user. So talk to your product owner, talk to your developer, try to add these fields into your application. Both parties will win. Then you also have something which is called a predicate string, which is also immediately going to the UI hierarchy of iOS. So there's no translation, and this really saves. We had a workshop yesterday, and just to give an example, for iOS, I think the accessibility ID and the predicate string, it took around 20 milliseconds just to find an element. But if you go, for example, to XPath, it will take you around 230, 260 milliseconds. And that now, when you hear this might not sound a lot, but if you do this 20 times, because you hit that home button or whatsoever, it will add up. And your test script will not have 20 times clicking on the button. I've seen huge test scripts, so it can save up to 20, 30 seconds even, if you're using the right selector. Having said that, you also have the class chain. The difference between those, the predicate string is only on one level, but if you look at the class chain, you can also go from parent to child. So if you know how to find at least the parent, but you need to click on the child or need to get the text of the child, it's a little bit easier. And then last but not least, if you really do not have any other option, still try to talk to your product owner, your scrum master, to your developer, just to add the other stuff. But if you have no other option, use XPath, but really try to prevent this as much as possible. It's really your last resort. And then when we've basically selected our selector, our locator strategy, then there's something else that we need to be aware of. I already mentioned that sometimes your script seems stuck, for example with those permission dialogues, but sometimes your script is also stuck when there's not a permission dialogue. It's basically waiting on something. And that waiting on something is related to the fact that the devices only have a single thread. And what does that mean? It basically means that it can only handle one thing at a time. And that one thing at a time is for your app, basically everything that happens in your app, but also everything that comes into your app. For example, the interaction from your Appium script. So let's see it like this. Your app, you have a banking app, your banking app is asking for data of your transaction timeline. It sends an API call, it gets the data back, and it's now and it's now kind of like translating that data. So that means that the thread itself is busy. And if you would now send your Appium command, Appium needs to wait. It's like you're on the highway, or at least you want to go into the highway. And if there's no traffic, you can just merge in. It's not a problem. But if there's a traffic jam, basically it's busy, you need to wait. Or you need to lower your speed, so it will take more time. That's basically also what's happening here. Appium needs to wait until the main thread is idle before it can get a response. So these are all kinds of things that we also need to be aware of. So we've now looked into kind of like some more technical things. Let's also take a look at choices Choices that we made that we thought were the right choices. But 9 out of 10 times also were the wrong choices. And I want to show you, and I think a lot of people might recognize themselves in Ross. You might have seen this scene where he finally has a date and he wants to impress his date by wearing leather pants. Everybody's seen this, I think, who has seen Friends. It's kind of like the same with us. We're doing something and we're like, okay, it works, but it feels off. And then later on you figure out what works basically doesn't fit anymore. But then you try to find a workaround. And during finding that workaround, you're really happy with your workaround. You're like, oh, nice, that's a nice workaround. But in the end, it even gets worse. And this is kind of like the things that we see. We make some wrong choices because we might not understand what we're doing. We didn't think about the fact that you could really sweat in leather pants. So let's also take a look at those assumptions, wrong choices. And one of the things that we tend to forget, to be honest, is that this is what our users are doing. Imagine that you're a parent. You just got your newborn. And you need to order groceries. So you've got your newborn on your left arm and you are ordering groceries, but then your newborn is going to cry. So you put away your phone, make sure that your baby is happy or sleeping or whatsoever. Pick up your phone, and again, you're proceeding. Well, first of all, we've done everything with one hand. Secondly, there was some difference between ordering stuff and proceeding. This is just a simple flow. This is not what we are doing with our automation scripts. And I'm not telling you to automate nursing a baby. No, but I'm just telling you to think about which situations you could have and how your end users are using them. But if you go back, this is basically what most of the tests are doing. We're trying to click on a button and then we try to get the text. And that's it. We're not thinking about gestures. Yesterday in the workshop I mentioned that a few years ago WhatsApp changed something in their application, which was basically just swiping between chats. Now every customer is expecting that every app that is out there just has that swiping. Just an expectation of your customer, not even knowing your app. You cannot force what you think the customer should do. It's the other way around. But if we talk about those gestures, when I've looked into a lot of frameworks, I've seen a lot of test cases. And what I then see is that people use, for example, an iPhone 17 or a Google Pixel as a device. They create their gesture, as we call it. But what they do that with fixed coordinates. And then they run it on a different device and they're like, okay, I'm pressing the wrong button. And I know this is just a click. But I wanted to make it a little bit easier also if you didn't want to put too much code also in here. But that click will just fail if you have a larger or a smaller screen. So try to think about this. Try to think about those gestures and how you can automate them based on what the device is that you're testing. And then this is also something that I've seen a lot. That people are filling in data and they try to find ways to just hide the keyboard. That they don't have any interruption of that keyboard. And I think if you want to have a stable script, yes, that's really awesome. Try to hide that keyboard always. But think around. I'm like, you could also hide some issues because what normally should happen, this is what your customer is expecting. He or she is pressing on an input field, keyboard pops up, and then also the user field should go up. But does your app do that? Or should the customer go outside of the keyboard, kind of like outside of the screen, and then scroll it up? Just a simple thing. We should be able to automate that and to look into that. And we don't need to create 100 test cases of this and for every input field, but we should be aware that we have this somewhere in our scripts because this is how your customer is using your application. They're not using it without the keyboard. They're using the keyboard. This is really important to also look into. And you can also do this manually. I don't mind, but be aware of that. And then this is also something, kind of like some wrong choices. I've heard so many people say, okay, I want to automate connecting to Bluetooth. I want to automate injecting images. That works. And I can understand that people want to do that because there are, for example, you've got a camera that you need to scan a lottery ticket, for example. But then also realize, what are you going to test? By default, an automation framework does not have support for this. Well, if you look at an emulator, you have this, but iOS doesn't have this. And if you look, for example, at cloud vendors, and I'm not trying to, be negative about cloud vendors, but cloud vendors have a solution for you, but realize what you're accepting here. They basically find a workaround to let you do Face ID, the biometric login, go from screen A to C, or to do the camera injection. But be aware of the fact that you're not testing the camera injection itself. You're just testing that the vendor just gave you a nice workaround and that they're really good in programming. It might help you going from screen A to C, but then also realize the risk that you're taking there. So like I mentioned, be aware, it's basically just good hacking from them. And then also something that I've seen a lot, same OS, but different behavior. And what I mean with this, if you, for example, look at Android, you've got your emulators, you've got your real devices, but they are not the same. They don't even have the same update cycle. And even if you read also the documentation, I didn't put the link in here. If you even read the documentation of the Android emulators, they just say it's there for developers to basically just see what they're building. It's not specifically for testing because it doesn't mimic what our end user does. And I'm now not preaching for real devices, but if we're then thinking about testing, we should at least have real devices, what our end users are using in your test scope. So one of the last things, we use a freshly booted device. We use full battery, no memory, no impact on the memory of other apps, no 20 apps in the background. Basically an ideal situation. Again, this is not what your end user is using. They have a phone with 100 apps on them. Imagine, again, going back to being the parent, you have hundreds, 10,000 pictures of your child on your phone, so memory is really, really low. Those are the things that we also need to be aware of. So also think about which risks you're accepting, at least when you're only doing the automation on ideal situations. And then again, your product manager is coming back to you, we need to proceed, we need to make more progress, we need to get more information about the feedback. You might know this one from Ross, that he's shouting, pivot, pivot. He wants to go around the corner. Imagine now this is your product owner or your manager. And basically what you just need to do here, be like Chandler, shout, shut up, because that was what Chandler was doing. And you wouldn't say that to your manager in those words. But you would say to your manager, okay, let's just sit down. Let's just go back to what we're doing this for. Because some things are not, we cannot push them through. We need to think about what we're doing. Do we really know our customer? So let's also get back to our customer. And also let's get back to what we've now seen. Because we basically are going nowhere. We know basically our car. We looked a little bit into automation itself. We looked into the engine, like understanding stuff from an Appium perspective. How does Appium work? We also learned a little bit about how we should test. So basically we got our driver's license, but all three will still not tell something about what we can do if we can really test. So do we also know something about the destination? And the destination could be kind of like just a country or vacation or holiday that we're going to, or maybe you're driving to France. Think about that. Let's think about that the person that we're going to is the destination. We're doing this for a real person. So everything that we script, we need to think about, okay, is this really what our end user is doing? On the web, normally you are focused. You are sitting behind your computer, and if you're doing that at home, your children already know that they should not interrupt you. Maybe you've got that sign on your back like genius at work, please do not. You might have that, but you then have the time to do, for example, hoovering over all elements, searching on the desktop, on your web page, just to find the right information. A user with his phone is interrupted all the time. He doesn't have that hoover. He doesn't have, you have a search, but imagine now how many clicks you need to do for your search, just to enable searching on the phone. So you also need to be aware of the fact that you think, what are you showing to your customer? Which information? That's also part of testing. Also the fact we have that mouse, that nicely mouse on the web, we do not have that on our phones. We scroll by default. And again, also that interruption, we do not have that 9 out of 10 times not on the web, but we have that on mobile. Also take that in your backpack when you're thinking about automation. So our destination would be to create also automation scripts, not only for the sake of scripting, but also for a real person. And then you would have basically a question with two versions. On the web, you normally would ask yourself, okay, does this work? But now also try to ask yourself, would a real person do this without thinking twice? And this is kind of like also good feedback that you can give back to your product owner, to the designers. And basically, if you think about this, then you might also have kind of like a shift in your mindset. Instead of kind of like what to test, that we have that real focus on scripting, think about that person. Will he or she really notice if it's broken? We also know what to test, and especially shortcuts are really useful. I'm not saying you should not have any shortcuts, but be aware of what you're accepting, because a shortcut is not what your customer is doing. So make sure that you have at least everything in your automation script properly. And also that maybe your workaround is working, going back to that image injection or to the biometric support, but in life, your end user might not be seeing this. So you have that green check mark in your pipeline, but it's not green at all. Your customer still has an issue. And also when we're talking about how to read it, it's not why is Appium broken, what does my customer experience? And sometimes you will see that basically your screen is stuck. And now you have at least the knowledge in where to look to. So in the end, license acquired, we only need to think also about our user. It's like Phoebe when she was driving her car and Ross was kind of like scaring the shit out of his, doing it in his pants. Let's say it like that. Oh, this is also recorded, sorry. So if we go back to everything that we've been talking about, we basically now know how to drive. We've got our mirrors, basically the snapshots. And we also know if you look in some mirrors of your car, you would see that objects might appear, appear closer than they are. It's the other way around for snapshots, but you need to be aware about what you're accepting here. Then we also have the locator strategy, basically navigating. How are you going to do that? Then we also have basically steering, the gestures that your end user is using, how they are using their application. And last but not least, also the passenger or the destination, that we think about how is this impacting them, and not only how is it impacting me regarding my script. So if we think about this, I like my last thoughts, and I think I have a few minutes left. We started with this. We started with Appium is clearly the problem. And I think based on what I've seen here from people, saw a few people also nodding, that we also realized that it's not only Appium, it's also the assumptions. And when we think about this, then that is also good news. Because if your tool was stuck, or if your tool was broken, you're stuck. You cannot do anything. But if it's basically your assumptions, you can change your mindset to your customer. And you can already do that today. So I promised that click. That was that click. And I want to say thank you. And if you have any questions, we still have a few minutes left. So if there are any questions, I don't know if there's a mic. No questions? Oh, it was so clear. That is nice. Yeah? Yes. I got the question about, do you have any experience with detox? Yes, I do have experience with detox. Assuming now that you're referring to detox from Wix to automate React Native applications, to be honest, detox is a really, really nice tool. But it's mainly only for React Native applications. So if you have an application where you have a flow where you need to automate, for example, also the browser, or do other stuff on your mobile device, then you're not able to do that with detox. Last but not least, you need to manipulate, or basically have, in other words, you need to have a specific test build for that. So you're basically not testing what your end user is also using that app. So there are basically two downsides. On the other hand, it is pretty fast. It will give you also visual feedback on everything that you click on. So that might at least help. And depending on the requirements you have, you might select detox or not. I did a talk about that 2018. It's on YouTube. First ever Appium conference where I did a research where also detox was part of that. So yeah, just putting that out there. Some commercial for myself. Anybody else? No?
I've actually got a question.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so in my last organization, we were using Appium and Source Labs for testing a retail app on iOS and Android.
Yes.
We had separate repositories for each app. Do you support that? Do you think that's a good idea? Or do you think there should be one repository and one suite for both Android and iOS?
And when you're talking about different repositories, you're talking about the testing repositories?
Yes.
Yeah. It all depends on, I hate that word, or those two words, it depends on, but those are three. Mouth. It all depends on the release cycle of the app and also the features that are implemented in the app. If you, for example, would look at WhatsApp for Android and for iOS, there's already a huge difference in flow. And if you would do that in one repository, if you would have Android automation and Appium Android and iOS automation in one repository, you need to work with a lot of if-else statements, and it's going to be a mess also to maintain. Then also think about release cycles where a feature was released on Android and not on iOS. So my suggestion would be not to do that, but there are certain things that you could reuse. So you might be able to think about an internal package that has gestures, for example. If you think about gestures themselves, so you would put common things in a package that you could use in Android and in iOS, and that could be specifically for flows, for interacting with devices. That's the thing that I would advise, but keep both basically just separate.
Do you think page object model is still the best strategy for organizing the elements for...
There were a lot of questions and also debates about page object model. I think we've seen it all from Cypress and from Playwright that they're saying, okay, we should use fixtures and we should use this or that. To be honest, I don't care. You should build an automation framework that's maintainable. And if you do that with even a different language, it's all up to you. But make sure that it is maintainable and that if something changes, you only need to change it in one place. And if you do that with page objects or with fixtures or with helpers or whatsoever, it's all up to you. Because some teams want to use fixtures, other teams want to use page objects. So advice would be keep it maintainable. That's the only thing I would do.
Any other questions, everyone? Anything else? No? Okay, great. Well,
one picture. I want to take a picture with you.
Thank you.
Hopefully it works. If my camera works. So, everybody hands up. Woohoo!
Nice
Cool.
one.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful. Thank you.